Hello, I'm Bennett Grubbs, the the Associate Director of Teaching and Professional Development at the American Political Science Association. Thank you for joining us for navigating the dissertation successfully. Second, just admitting someone. This is a webinar hosted by the APSA Committee on the status of graduate students in the profession. This committee serves to inform the American Political Science Association about issues pertinent to graduate students. I will share in the chat room a link to their website featuring some both previous webinars as well as eventually the recording of this event. And you can find information about their graduate fund as well. Thank you. I'm going to pass it off to one of the co-chairs of the graduate committee, Salah Ben Hamoud.
Thank you so much for that, Bennett. And I want to extend a thanks to all the audience members as well as our panelists for deciding to join us today. So just to reiterate, this is the second iteration of this workshop series that we're doing. This workshop series seeks to demystify some of the more ambiguous parts of graduate school and seeks to kind of help with equities and ensuring that graduate school is more equitable for students across all walks of life throughout the discipline. So just a few words about the way that this workshop is going to go down. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Andrew, who's going to go over the slides here. After that, we're going to talk to our esteemed panelists here and open it up for Q&A. We'll start off with the first question, and then we'll open it up for the audience to ask their questions as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew McWard. I'm an assistant professor at Denison University on my first year on the tenure track right now. I'm on the APSA Committee on the Status of Graduate Students. You can see all of our beautiful faces right there. In my second year on the committee. And I'm just going to briefly talk about what a dissertation kind of entails in very broad strokes, because I want to leave more time for our panelists. But some of you might be first, second, maybe even prospective graduate students. And so dissertation can seem like a very abstract, amorphous thing. And indeed, as a first or second year, you might be focused on your coursework. You might be focused on your comprehensive exams. You might even be focused on generating working papers before you start thinking about your larger dissertation topic. But eventually you have to make that ABD status, all but dissertation. And I always find that term very humorous because the but in that is like the biggest of all buts, of all but your dissertation, which is, as the slide says, the culmination of your graduate school journey. It is the main purpose of what you're trying to achieve in graduate school. And you're trying to generate original research that is your work and all that. So I apologize if you hear my colleagues yelling in the hallway next door. Sometimes they can be loud. And this is your methodological and theoretical training, but it's your own independent research, and it often starts with a prospectus, data collection, interviews, etc., and original argument. And it's aiming to contribute to one or several bodies of literature in your field. And moving ahead, you can kind of very broadly talk about two types of dissertations. Sometimes called the book dissertation versus the three-paper dissertation. This kind of indicates what kind of publications might come for dissertation after you defend. Something we'll hear about from our panelists in a second. Essentially, the book dissertation might turn into a full-length book or monograph, whereas the three-paper dissertation will be 3 separate published papers. The distinction here, well, let's go to the next slide, Salah, and I can kind of show you what my own dissertation looked like as a quote-unquote book dissertation. And so it was 6 chapters, introduction and literature review, 1 main theoretical argument, with 3 supporting chapters as empirical evidence. And so for me, that was a quantitative chapter, qualitative chapter, and then a second quantitative chapter. In the first quantitative chapter, I used other people's data. In the second quantitative chapter, I actually collected my own original data sets to answer that part of the question. Okay. But essentially, the distinction here is you've got 3 different chapters of empirics with 1 kind of main argument. Okay. Now, if you go to the next slide on 3-paper dissertation, like the book dissertation, this will often have 3 different empirical chapters, but you tend to be asking 3 different but related questions. And you might get different answers from folks on how related these questions are. I was once talking to a pretty eminent senior scholar who said that his committee essentially let him staple 3 papers together. But presumably, if you have a field of study, there are 3 related questions, each with their own empirical evidence. And so the distinction between 3 paper and book dissertation, in terms of the work you're doing, it might be more similar, actually, because it's still 3 different empirical tests, usually strung together with the same kind of themes. I'll go back slide real quick. So yeah. So one kind of point I want to make that, the difference between choosing a book or a 3-paper dissertation depends on you, your work, and it's definitely something you should have an in-depth conversation with your advisor about. And some questions that the panelists might be able to address is the implications for what you do after graduation. One trade-off I've heard, which may or may not be true, is that the book, it takes a little bit longer to publish as a graduate student, or at least, sorry, defend as a graduate student. But it might be easier on the tenure track to publish a book versus 3 separate papers, in which case you might need to add more papers onto that to achieve tenure. So that may be a trade-off between the work you're doing in graduate school versus the work you're doing in your first post-tenure job. And yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that there's some trade-offs that kind of occur, and you might want to talk with your advisor about what those trade-offs might be professionally. And of course, the work does not end when you graduate. Next slide. Finally, the other kind of big distinction types, which we should always keep in mind, is that there's also only 2 types of dissertations: the perfect dissertation and of course the finished dissertation, right? And so as you're contributing towards your dissertation, you should not let perfect be the enemy of good. And really, at the end of the day, you could always do more, but it does have to be done for you to actually graduate. Okay. Various stages. We're going to hear from our panelists on those various stages. First is after your coursework, after you pass comprehensive exams, you'll have your prospectus, your proposal stage. Haasan's going to talk to us about that. This depends on the program, but at the very least, after comps and after your prospectus, you are now officially ABD, all but dissertation. And then you have however long it takes to finish the thing. But like I kind of mentioned before, the dissertation does not end at your defense, right? Particularly if you go into academia afterwards, you're going to want to turn your dissertation into publications and deliver some publications from your dissertation. Like I said, it might be a book, it might be several articles, it might be a book and an article. Something we're also going to hear about from our panelists. I think particularly Christina will talk about that as well. Okay. Now we have our panelists. Salah, you want to introduce our panelists and we'll take it away?
Yeah, so our panelists here are, as Andrew mentioned, addressing 3 different types of stages of the dissertation. So Haasan is going to be talking to us about the prospectus stage, where it's like to be crafting and moving towards defending a proposal, which then would allow him to, or allow graduate students more generally, to then move on to developing their dissertation. Christina is going to be talking to us about how you can essentially draw out deliverables out of your dissertation, be that a book or 3 or papers out of it. Sometimes you can do these simultaneously. In some cases, you can actually draw out a paper as an introductory, one of your introductory chapters as a paper, and then leave the rest for the book project. And then Dr. Nista Carranza-Coe, who's an associate professor at the University of Baltimore, will be talking to us about mentorship and what mentorship is like for the dissertation stage, what it's like to mentor graduate students who are working on their dissertations. So again, feel free to ask questions after we've asked our own questions. First, we're going to hear a little bit from each panelist, and from there, we'll open it up for the Q&A. So Haasan, if you'd like to start us off, you can feel free to do so.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Salah. So like I said, Haasan Parker, I'm a 3rd-year PhD student at Wisconsin State International Relations. And as a 3rd year, I've passed my comprehensive exams. I'm done with classes after this semester, so I'm just purely in the prospectus writing stage. And I guess a couple points I'll quickly go over just to start off. I want to things I wish I had done earlier, and like sort of just tips I could tell myself like 8 months ago. I think the big thing about the prospectus is just start meeting with faculty pretty early, in the 2nd year, once you've done your exams, definitely like by the time you're like officially supposed to be writing it. So for me, in the first semester of my 3rd year, I didn't want to meet with faculty too much before I had like a solid idea of what I wanted to do, because I was like, I need to have something impressive to start And like looking back, I kind of wasted a lot of time just like kind of debating in my own head and not really being focused. And one faculty member told me a really kind of good anecdote. He said, I said I didn't want, I was worried about meeting people because I didn't want to come off or I didn't want to have any idea that was like too half-baked to show to these professors in the department. I want to impress people. He told me, well, don't worry about that. The prospectus is only ever 3/4 baked, right? It's not the full dissertation. It's not something we're going to hold you to. It's just, it's a plan so that we can, set you loose and do your own research. So, it's only ever 3/4 baked is like the one thing I've taken away from this process. And I really appreciated that one. Another thing is just be aware of the timeline at the start of my third year. I met with a professor and he told me, if you want to have it done by June, you need to have all the Prospectus committee members that you want. You need to talk to them pretty early on, and you want to have a draft by X date, and it's just sort of backwards timeline. And I've not stuck to his timeline, but just to get the idea in my head that this is kind of where you should be, I think that was super important. And beyond the professor's timelines, it's also important to just talk to other older graduate students just to see, okay, when are people actually getting these things done? Are they getting it done like during the third year in the fall semester or the spring semester of the third year? Are they getting it done over the summer? Are some people getting it done the fourth year? Like what's the de jure rules around this? What's de facto what's actually happening? Don't overload your schedule in that year you're supposed to be writing a prospectus, because that's I just kind of signed up for a bunch of things that took time away from writing a prospectus, and I wish I had that time back now. But so don't sign up for too many other things. Talk to committee members. This is another thing that I was thinking of. Committee members that might not be immediately obvious that these three people study something that's like closely related to my research interests. And you think, okay, those people have to be on my committee for the prospectus. And actually, I think, obviously, you want topic overlap or research interest overlap, but something I underrated is people who you are who you like meeting with, who will keep you accountable, who you maybe have a pre-existing relationship with, or there's like an easy going relationship with that you can actually, you'll want to meet with them. You won't feel guilty or kind of anxious when you have a meeting and you maybe haven't done as much. And that doesn't have to have a ton of research overlap. So like the person I'm meeting with the most doesn't even really study IPE, which is sort of where my dissertation is. But I took a class with her in my first semester, and I already had a relationship with her, and like she can give good sort of research methodological feedback, research design feedback, and in a way that even if she doesn't study a specific topic I want, it's sort of still a good match in that sense. So I would say don't worry too much about having perfect research interest overlap for everyone. Just think about the other considerations around the organizational aspect and just how you work aspect for professors. And lastly, I'll just say like kind of managing at Wisconsin, we have like 3 people on our Prospectus committees, just sort of managing the different the feedback relationships with the different professors. How I've done it is I meet with them at pretty different schedules. Some people I meet once every 3 weeks. Some people I meet once a week. Some people I meet once a month. And that can very easily pull you in like 3 different directions. So I like to sort of hear from everyone, work on something that kind of addresses everything, and then present that to the different people. But I would say don't let people kind of pull you in 3 different directions. This is your work, this is your perspective. They obviously have to sign off on it, but and they are giving you good feedback, but there's a million things you can take, different ways you can take things, and you have to choose at a certain point. So I would just say, make sure, stand your own ground, make a choice, defend it, but obviously listen to feedback as well. But yeah, that's my opening statement, I guess.
No, thank you so much for that. Those are a lot of really good points. And Later on, I'm going to let the other panelists speak in a second, but I'm going to come back to this when I'm talking about experiences as an ABD. So I'm currently an ABD right now, and there's a lot of spillover between what you're doing at the prospectus stage and when you're also actually executing the dissertation. But before that, I want to hear from Dr. Codiero about what it's like after the defense in terms of producing deliverables and what it's like to, go through that process after you've achieved a tenure track position or a postdoc and you're trying to actually produce things out of your dissertation.
Yeah, thank you. I really liked those comments from Haasan, especially about the dissertation or the prospectus not having to be fully baked. Honestly, your dissertation as you're defending it will also not be fully baked. It will not be a fully baked, book or set of chapters, really. I think you'll find by the time you defend your dissertation that you have a very fully baked job market paper and then a collection of other things that you had to finish, right? To avoid sort of the perfect being the enemy of the good. Okay, but just to take a step back, so my name is Christina. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Utah. I defended my dissertation in spring 2021 at UC San Diego. And then I did a postdoc before starting at the University of Utah. My perspective on all of this is, partly talking from the perspective of someone who wrote a book style dissertation. And one of the things but has also published articles out of it or is publishing articles out of it. One thing I would say about writing a book style dissertation in general which I think was good advice, is write it as book-like as you can from the get-go. So don't think of what you're doing if you're writing a book style dissertation as anything other than writing a book. What I mean by that, I think one good thing to do is look at other people's first books that they published their dissertation into a book, and look at sort of the structure, look at sort of how the chapters, flow, and, sort of diagram out that structure, and then write your dissertation sort of in a structure like that, right? Like, this is what a first book looks like. Just write your dissertation as if you're writing a book from the get-go, because that was the advice I was given, and I think it's made my life a bit easier. So I was able to have a book workshop, I guess, a year and a half after I defended my dissertation. And that was, partly that it's been sort of moving along a bit faster, partly because I wrote it like a book from the get-go, whereas I think one of the traps people fall into is that they sort of, don't write their dissertation in a super structured way, and then they have to rewrite the entire thing after they get a job. So attempt to save yourself from doing that by just, even if it's kind of scary, just be like, hey, well, if I've decided to do a book style dissertation, guess what? I'm writing a book. It's going to look like one, not going to look like a very good book by the time you defend your dissertation, but, get the sort of structure right. I would also say, in terms of the question of, if you have a book style dissertation, how much article wise can you publish before you run yourself into trouble? So my general advice that I've been given is it's good to have, before you approach publishers, and I'm happy to talk about that too, but it's good actually to have at least one article published out of the dissertation as sort of proof of ideally somewhere, that's a sign of quality in the field journal wise, because it's sort of proof of concept that people find what you're doing in the book credible. If you publish more than 2 or 3 articles out of the book, you might run into issues where, if every single chapter has already been published somewhere else, a book publisher might be like, okay, this is all already published elsewhere. What is the added value here in like stapling them together? So it's, sort of a balancing act, but publishing at least, like 2 articles from your book is totally fine. I would say, again, thinking about also more from the paper style side of things, or like the job market paper, and how to try to get that out quickly as you're sort of wrapping up your dissertation. There's a lot that could be said about what sort of journals you should target. You know, I think one issue some people might run into is either targeting, you know, not being aware of how slow some journals are when sending stuff to them. Right. So you sort of want to target, like when you're early on, especially before you have a tenure track job, and you need to go on the market soon, I think it's good to figure out like what journals have a good quality signal in my subfield, but are not extraordinarily slow. So by talking to people, you can figure out which journals run efficiently, and I would recommend sending to those. So after I started my job, I currently have a paper under review at one of the journals that is sort of notoriously slow. And if I was on the job market right now, I'd probably be pretty stressed because they are taking a wildly long time with my paper. So be strategic, I guess all just to say, be strategic about what journals you're targeting, partly based on your career stage. You don't want to end up at one of the notoriously slow journals and be stressed. And also just strategic about the type of, as you're writing the paper, studying the structure of papers in similar journals, of similar articles that the journal you want to target has recently published, and, sort of paying attention to fit is another thing that I think is important. I don't want to go on too long here. I guess the other thing I would just say is that I would recommend sort of planning out your pipeline as you're finishing your dissertation, to try to always make sure that you're spending some of your days each week focusing on getting the dissertation stuff out, because you're going to get really sick of it, want it to be published and done with so you can move on to other things. But if you move on to other side projects and then have to come back to it, that can be kind of painful. So don't sort of get distracted by side quests when you're trying to get the dissertation published. And then, as you're finishing up sort of, transitioning the dissertation into a book or journal articles, just figuring out what time of day works best for you to write every single day and protecting that time. So maybe I'm weird, but I write the best at late afternoon. And I refuse to answer emails, deal with anything teaching related. Like, everyone has to leave me alone during a certain time block in the afternoon, assuming I'm not teaching. And so those are just a few things, but I'm happy to talk about anything else related to my experience.
Thank you so much for that. And I think one point that I really resonated with, because it applies to the dissertation writing process too, is not to get distracted by the side quests. Because even when you are going on the market, you also want to show that you have longevity and that you have all these projects in the pipeline. But related to that is okay, they also want to see that you have a magnum opus style thing, right, with your dissertation, and it's actually getting done. So I think that's a really good point that applies to the dissertation writing stage as well. Now we're going to move on to Dr. Carranza Ko, who's going to speak a little bit about mentorship and what it's like to mentor graduate students who are working on their dissertation. So I'll pass it over to her now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Salah, for introducing me, and thank you to the committee for having me here. And I think I echo a lot of the same sentiments that Haasan has mentioned, and also that Dr. Cotiero has mentioned in terms of, dissertations and the processes and the things that you have to remember. The book part, I think that was the advice that I got as well. So I think that was really something that resonated with me. So I'm looking at this from the perspective of mentorship. So I'm on the other side, if you will. And I think one thing that Haasan said really resonated with me, which is checking in, right? Checking in with the faculty member. And in a way, what you're doing is from the faculty member as well. So I think the faculty also have to be responsible for this to a certain extent, to build a rapport, to build that rapport with the student, to have a certain type of timeline so that you would be continuously checking in on the work of the student, but not as a hawk, I think it's different than being a hawk, more like providing them with some kind of a guidance, some kind of a goal. So in 2 months, we're going to check in. I'll see you then. You know, a week before we check in terms of our meeting, then the student oftentimes, in my experience, has been would send me the paper. I would have comments ready. We would have the meeting. And then after the meeting, I would ask and request the student to take 1 week off, not to work on side projects, but actually just take a week off. And most of our students, at least at the University of Baltimore, have been full-time working professionals. The last student that I actually mentored in terms of his dissertation is a diplomat in the Organization of American States. So he was working full-time and actually finishing up his dissertation. And so in his case, you know, I actually asked him, is it possible for you to take some, you know, time off from your work? And he was able to take some time aside and just do nothing, whether it is, you know, taking a vacation with your family, go visiting friends, or I don't know, if you're a Swiftie, go to a Taylor Swift concert, or if you're an NFL, you know, aficionado, like do your thing, right? Just take a week off, stop thinking about the dissertation. It's not going to get better. The comments and the feedback session really suck in many different ways. I mean, it might feel empowering at times, but other times you might feel like, what are they talking about? What's the faculty talking about? They have no idea what they're doing. I know what I'm doing better than anybody else. But then the week after, when you come back to it, all those comments and all that, you know, note that you had written on the side, which, you know, that's another encouragement that you do, to take notes on everything. And I actually take notes as well as the student take notes in these meetings. They start making sense to you. And at that point, you can actually start making the revisions calmly, normally, and with regards to your mental health. And I want to talk about that point about the mental health aspect. I know oftentimes we don't talk about it. It's the elephant in the room. But the dissertation process is lonely. It's a fight against you and yourself, right? You have to set the goals. You have to be the one writing. You have to be the one revising. And you have to be able to make it through the finish line, in addition to having stuff in the pipeline, preparing stuff in the material for the job market, figuring out if you need to do a postdoc and whatnot. And, you know, tenure track jobs these days are very becoming much more difficult, and the field is becoming quite hard in many different ways. So I think mental health, and the reason why it goes back to the same idea of taking the week off, is to address that aspect, right? We all need to be a little bit kinder to each other in addressing the fact that this is going to be at times a very much of a mental health challenge. And that has been published by different scholars from the English literature side and others in the Chronicles of Higher Education. We're openly talking about alcoholism and things like that in academia, which is real. So I think I just wanted to put that out there as part of the mentorship, that I'm actually actively trying to check in and make sure that the mental health side is also taken into consideration, that that's something that faculty that are helping with the dissertation process and coaching in the dissertation process, we need to be also aware of that. And my hope is that as a result of people talking about it more openly, we are more aware of that and we take that into consideration. One thing that I just want to mention in terms of the dissertation process, again, from the side of the mentorship, in my case, what I tell the students is to have, or to think about the dissertation process as in terms of stages, right? Where you have the stage of research, stage of writing, stage of analysis. So I totally agree with, you know, having a certain number of hours blocked off to write. I think that's great. Some people prefer to do the Pomodoro technique. So all these things I tell the students, but I also know personally for me, none of that actually works. For me, what works is I set a goal, the very achievable goal, which is 200 words a day. However, whichever form, it can be a bibliography entry that will make up for the 250. So I tell the students that there's going to be days when you're going to encounter writer block. You can't write. And there's going to be days when you can write really well. But at a minimum, you know, to set the minimum of 250 and then continuing on the process, again, if you cannot write something analytical, then focus on the literature review, summarize articles, get to the easier tasks that you do. In addition to that, one of the great advice that I got being mentored was to have a checklist. The physical activity of crossing off the things that you have to do. Actually, psychologists have proven that that helps you in terms of managing your anxiety and your mental health. So we go back to that whole idea again. And again, that's because I've seen studies after studies regarding the fact that we have the elephant in the room we don't talk about, which is mental health. So that's the kind of the relationship or rapport that I think is important for the faculty to establish with the student going through the dissertation phase, understanding that it's not only the dissertation that they are handling, but also they're handling the job market and other different materials as well. But I echo everything else in terms of the book. I'm actually in favor of the thinking about the dissertation as a book, because I think it helped me in different ways as well. But I'll leave it at that so that we have enough time for question and answers.
No, thank you so much for that. And I think, sorry, I think the focus on mental health is especially important. And if we had time, Andrew, do you think we have time for me to give some brief comments on like ABD status, what it's like to be an ABD?
Yeah, I think we do. And I have one comment as someone who finished the dissertation recently, but it'd be very quick. But Salah, I think we definitely do. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just like briefly mention this like importance of mental health that Dr. Kronzako was going over. And that was something that I really struggled with when I finished the prospectus. And Andrew and I have spoken about this privately before. It's just this idea of post-prospectus fatigue is a very real thing. Once you finish your prospectus, you're not additionally going to know what to do. In many cases, you're going to feel a little overwhelmed. And keep in mind, you just finished coursework, so everything is hitting you really hard. And this is like exacerbated during the post-prospectus stage. So in that case, this is where this is where a lot of my insights come from, is like how to manage that, how to deal with that. Because at the flip side, you also have suddenly you have a lot of free reign, a lot of free time. You no longer have coursework to structure your day-to-day life, and you also have, again, like the fatigue like looming over you. So for me, I found what helped me best is to find a balance between having some type of a structured and a flexible workflow. So I think the idea of like writing 250 words a day is perfect for that. While there is some kind of accountability mechanism there, it isn't so strict to the point where, you know, if you can't commit to it, or you have to commit to something really lofty in order to feel like you're being productive. I think having a baseline that is manageable on an everyday basis is incredibly important. And something else that I'll also mention is really developing a routine with your advisor based on the way that you specifically work. And this is going to vary for folks. So I'll speak on my own experience. For me, I tend to be a little bit more autonomous with the way that I work. So I like having about like maybe a month or two where I don't really check in with my advisor. I'm just working on my own stuff at my own pace. And then I produce material. Other folks need a little bit more of, in other words, like micromanagement in a sense to keep accountable. And I think, you know, recognizing your own strengths and your own limitations and what you're able to produce alone and with somebody else is incredibly important. I think it's really important to communicate that with your advisor very early on, especially when you're developing your prospectus committee before you even get to the dissertation stage, because that's going to determine the trajectory more long term. And finally, the something else I'll mention is, especially if you're not on a time crunch, and this is where the what Dr. Kronzako was saying about taking time off is important, comes in. I would not be afraid of prioritizing other parts of your life once you finish coursework and once you finish your prospectus. In other words, think of it as watering other parts of your life that you have not watered because you've been so busy in graduate school. Like, it's no secret that it takes a toll on us, and you either isolate yourself socially, you either like you no longer have hobbies, your identity is just a graduate student. So I think getting back into like, you know, actually becoming a well-rounded person is an important part of what you should be doing during the dissertation to kind of keep your sanity and keep yourself afloat. And yeah, that's generally my thoughts on the ABD stage.
I'll just add on a quick comment, and I would just, you know, +2 to what everyone has already said, and particularly with the working regularly, if that's setting a time as, you know, these 2 hours I will work, or this goal I will achieve. Another way you can kind of frame it is, I will work at least 15 minutes on this every day. And some days, 15 minutes is all you can give it. And then you got to walk away, take a break, do something else. But other days, the 15 minutes will turn into 4 hours, right? And just insisting that you do at least this little part and you give it a 15-minute go. But you don't punish yourself if that's all you can give it. I find personally very helpful. I'm trying to get in that habit as an assistant professor now for publications. I think we can go ahead with our first question, and I would invite the audience to either raise your hand to ask a question or put one in the chat. But the first question that I think Salah and I wanted to ask was, put yourselves back before you're in your prospectus stage, before your ABD, and for first and second year PhD students, what should you be thinking about as you start considering dissertation topics, structures, goals? And maybe how much should you actually be thinking about the dissertation at that stage? So I think our first question, and then please do put questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask in person.
Do we also raise our hands? How are we responding?
Raising hands could be good. Why not?
Okay. Where's the stupid hand? I'll raise my hand. Yeah, so what I think it's important to do in your first 2 years, one piece of, I think in the first 2 years, it's good to be, you're sort of cycling through, testing out different ideas in your classes, like, because now you have great access to faculty in your first 2 years, you're taking classes with them. Chances are, some of them might have assignments that ask you to come up with a proposal of a research design, or, you're taking an IP class, so you have to write, some sort of proposal of an IP paper, whatever it is. So you have the ability to test out ideas. And, if something, in your first couple of years sticks and carries through, great. If not, that's totally normal. I thought I was going to do one thing, based on my seminar paper in my second year. Over the summer, I realized it was not going to be very feasible. But one thing that helped me sort of realize what I was going to do instead, that I recommend in terms of coming up with ideas, is, and especially, if you have a particular area, sort of topic wise, that you're focused on, or a particular region, or both, is to listen to lots of podcasts constantly. I was incessantly listening to news podcasts, like think tank podcasts focused on the region or the topic, subscribing to a bazillion newsletters on the topic / the region. And then, because everyone wants to come up with a good puzzle, right? And then I would, you see or you hear or you see some sort of news headline, and you're like, well, that's weird. Why did they do that? And then you just are, keeping track. All right. I had a Word document where I was always keeping track of ideas or puzzles I had stumbled upon while reading my 19th newsletter of the week. And then, you sort of test out running with those. So I would just sort of recommend picking up a habit like that, so that you might, come across more things that you can write down as potential ideas to brainstorm on with faculty.
So that was a really good point. I just want to piggyback off of it really quick, especially when it comes to regional and topical expertise. One of the best things that I did in my experience when I was in my first and second year is I broke away from reading political science stuff in general and just started reading histories of the regions I was interested in. And that did so much more for me than just going through the very redundant quantitative, qualitative stuff that we're doing, where it's more analytical and just kind of getting a basic lay of the land for what the region or the topics are that you're interested in, and things like reading sociology studies or even just general histories was immensely more beneficial for me than sticking to just the political science stuff that we've been doing. As Dr. Carranza-Coe, if you want to go next.
I think, I echo everything that you both said. I think for me, it was the same thing. I was reading different types of things. I was actually reading a lot of historical novels because I found them to be less boring at times. Historical, novels, and based on, real facts and things like that, but, turned into an interesting fictional way. And definitely listening to a lot of podcasts, but I guess it depends on the school. And let me put it very bluntly. If your school has enough money to fund the graduate students to just attend conference and not present, then definitely take advantage of that. Depending on where your university is at, there's also regional conferences that you can go to. You can easily drive there. Just go and listen to the different ideas that people have been thinking about or talking about. That also helps you kind of stimulate your thinking about the different things. The thing that I did when I was in first or second year, I just remember trying to figure out what I was not bored with. And that's how, I was able to start narrowing things down, because this dissertation thing that you're going to be holding on for, right? It's going to be with you for years. I mean, you get tired, get very, very tired with this thing. So you want to make sure you get into some kind of a field that you find at least not that boring for you. Again, Haasan, I know you do IP. For me, that's very, very different than what I do. So my apologies, but I would find that boring. And just like you would find what I do very boring, and that's okay. We're different people, but I think figuring out what I wasn't bored with helped me out in, thinking, okay, maybe I can go this route and it's going to be okay. I'm not going to feel too lonely.
Yeah, and real quick on that as well, there's often a tendency for folks to tell us to chase the headlines in terms of like, oh, what are folks doing research on now, or what's kind of capturing the news cycle. And I'll say that's like some of the worst advice you could ever give somebody, because if you're not interested in what you're doing, you're not going to last. Haasan, what you wanted to comment on the question?
No, yeah, exactly. Just picking back on what everyone else said. Just pick something here, like find out what actually interests you. And this is an interesting thing for me, is that I like found a topic that I was like interested in. I like kept coming back to this in the different seminar papers. But when I would have meetings this year and they're asking me like, okay, like what's the actual core thing you're interested, like why does this interest you? And I had to think like, actually, I'm not, it's not entirely clear to me like what was interesting about my topic. I just knew like something was interesting. And so that was, a major struggle, not struggle, I guess struggle, of like, settling on a specific research question and then designing this proposal is like, what's the core thing you're actually interested in here? And yeah, so just find that, exploring, like you said, reading non-political science things, I love listening podcasts as well. So listening podcasts, reading the news, just learning more and like, actually sort of doing some thinking about, okay, I have a inclination towards this, but like really what's driving that? And that's kind of what you gotta focus on.
No, exactly. And I think that's like the major theme here, is really just hone in on what you're interested in. Forget the naysayers. Like I see here that there was like the comment about interdisciplinary work not being recommended. Again, forget about the naysayers, focus on what you're interested in, because that's what's going to eventually allow you to produce your best work and keep your interest and your sanity throughout your time in the PhD program. I think now we can move into questions from the audience. If anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand and you can go ahead and have that done now.
While we wait, I'll tell just a brief anecdote while people gather courage to either put something in the chat or raise your hand. But my dissertation topic personally came out of a course discussion for a course that I almost didn't take. I went to my advisor's office and I said, I don't really want to take this course. It doesn't seem very relevant to me. I think I can skip it. And she's like, well, this is maybe a pretty important course to take. It will cover some basic principles of international relations. I'd advise you at least just take it and see if you like it. And that's the course and the discussions and readings that actually led to my actual dissertation topic. And that wasn't until my second year of graduate school. So that flexibility and that being open for what your topic might actually be your first 2 years, I would highly suggest. So should we have other questions prepared. Should we go ahead and ask one of ours?
Yeah, another question, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess
go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess another question that we had, and this is more on the bit of the negative side, is what should you do when you're working on your dissertation and then things end up going wrong? Like, how do you deal with setbacks? And anybody on the panel can feel free to answer this question. Yeah, Dr. Karanzaka.
Yeah, let me tackle that, and then also there's a question on the chat. Maybe I can tackle that as well. I remember when my dissertation, or I was working on my dissertation, and it didn't go exactly as I was expecting in terms of some of the findings that I had, I wrote it down. I literally said, okay, it went against the findings that I had. And maybe there's an interesting question to explore about that. Why did it go the way that I wasn't expecting? Then it became a second puzzle for me to tackle onto and then, extrapolate further. So it actually became a very interesting discussion about why, and again, going back to my dissertation, why certain states, abided by the norms that they had adopted in terms of transitional justice norms as policies, whereas others did not, and what did that difference actually mean, and why some states advanced while others did not, and what did that actually mean? So that helped me in figuring out what to do next. In terms of the questions that is being asked about political science jobs and interdisciplinary departments, I think it really depends. When I made that comment about interdisciplinary work, back then, when I was doing my work on transitional justice, it was still relatively new field. And I was someone that was doing basically IR work, but also very much comparative politics and weirdo. And at that time, that was very shunned upon because there was a very strong push for me, at least from even mentors outside the department, to be more mainstream, to focus on the more, I guess, just focus either on norm regarding questions, something else, and not necessarily towards a transitional justice route. At that time, there was only political science working on it, and then the rest were. And so I think it really depends on, Anthony, where it is that you see yourself going next. I did not want to let go of that topic because I really believed that there was merit to that. And that became the starting point of how my career trajectory started, which is, the work that I do currently is also much more interdisciplinary. I do work on indigenous women's rights movements in Peru and whatnot, and in Korea as well. So I think it's much more interdisciplinary, but there are departments that are interdisciplinary and that are going to be looking for people that do that kind of work as well. So I think rather than thinking about, should I gear your dissertation this way or that way, just focus on writing the paper, the dissertation that you are interested in. Get the help from the faculty. As everybody has said, a completed dissertation it's not the same thing as a perfect one, but you just need to complete it to get to the next level.
I guess I'm the only one with my hand up, so I'll just talk. So what I would recommend on that question, well, yeah, so I guess what to do when things go wrong kind of depends how things are going wrong, like in what way are things going wrong. But as a general rule of thumb, I guess attempt to not panic, realize that it's totally normal to have like things go very wrong, like, and have to completely pivot and rely heavily on your advisors to figure out like the most strategic way to do that. So hopefully you have good people you can go to figure out how to pivot. But just know that, like, probably a lot of the people that you now know who are in tenure track positions and like tenured had things go wrong when they were writing their dissertations. I certainly had things go wrong when I was writing my dissertation, and like a chapter I thought I was going to write, I was like, I can't actually write this chapter. Had to scrap that, do something else. Like, just know that it's a normal part of the process. And seldom does a dissertation go in a completely linear, well, orderly, nice fashion with nothing going wrong. So yeah, it's sort of just a matter of, the people, you'll finish if you're willing to pivot no matter what and figure out something to do. There's always something else you can do. In terms of the interdisciplinary thing, specifically if you're going to apply for political science and criminology jobs, I think I wouldn't write my dissertation any differently. What I would do is make sure you have people on your committee who are both political scientists and people in criminology departments, because the thing you're going to find, because the way you're writing your dissertation is based on the specifications of who's on your committee, but when it comes down to applying for jobs, it's all about how you frame what you're doing. So the way you explain what you're doing to people who are reading a cover letter in a criminology department is probably like the things you emphasize or de-emphasize about what you're doing is going to be different than what is going to go into your political science cover letter. So, it's, the dissertation is, you're answering whatever your question is the best way you possibly can with the data, methods, tools available to you. But I think really when it comes down to it, it's just how do you sell it? Like, how do you market it? So have people from both fields on your committees, because people in one field will tell you how to sell it to that field. People in the other field will tell you how to sell it in that field, but it shouldn't really, I don't think, affect how you actually write the dissertation. And then, yeah, just on the monograph dissertation, I think, maybe I said this at the beginning, but there is a difference in writing it because in my view, if you're writing a book style dissertation, you're planning to go for a tenure track job where that's going to be part of your tenure package, you should be approaching it like you're writing a book, not like you're writing 3 papers with 2 other chapters tacked on. So again, look at like someone's first book in your subfield, and sort of sketch out the structure of that and follow that.
Does anybody else want to answer the question about the monograph or give their perspective on that monograph? And if not, we can also move into the other question here about which one is best when you're working on the dissertation, to have like a dedicated study room or just work from anywhere.
So we also have a question from Agum here,
Okay, yeah.
who I think was before the question on where to work from.
Oh, okay, awesome. Boom, if you can go ahead and ask your question. Thank you for that.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, everyone, for your insights. This is very helpful. So I kind of have a pretty vague question, perhaps. I'm hoping to enter the job market in the fall, that period. And so I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on sort of juggling the various aspects of sort of like being a late stage PhD candidate, which includes like teaching and writing the dissertation, but also sort of working on a publication, but also applying sort of for jobs and preparing job market materials. Do you have any advice on sort of like juggling and sort of balancing these sort of competing things when stakes are pretty high? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
I don't have to keep talking, but I have an opinion for everything. So I'm always happy to. Yeah, one thing I would say about that, I mean, first of all, I think the stuff about mental health is really important at that stage when you're about to go on the job market, because it is like the most stressful time of your life. So be kind to yourself if you feel like you're not achieving whatever your sort of ideal balancing act of 7 different things is. But one thing I will say is especially with respect to like balancing teaching and research, one thing I found helpful is create barriers to allowing yourself to over prepare. And so this is going to partially depend on like whether you're angling for jobs at like teaching track focused universities or research universities. But as someone, at sort of on like a research university track, it's easy to let yourself over prepare for teaching. Like we're probably all perfectionists. So one thing I would do is so if I'm teaching in like the afternoon on a Tuesday, like an undergrad class, not allow myself to prepare until that morning. So I literally can't, like, it will be impossible for me to spend more than say, 2 or something hours or 3 hours prepping, because I have not allowed myself, like, if you start a couple days in advance, you might, keep coming back to your slides, tweaking at the margins. So prevent yourself from having the ability to do that. So that's one thing I have to say about like how to force yourself to not, because I'm sort of someone who can like, if I know I should be working on research, but I'm avoiding doing something, I'll just go like tweak my teaching stuff. Like, don't let yourself do that. So I might be missing part of your question, but that's sort of my take on, part of the time management aspect of that.
Here, I'll piggyback on that and I'll take the same question. Yeah, I think you have to be protective of your time if you're trying to produce research and trying to do research. Somebody, a retired professor a long time ago, she gave me advice. She said, you said teaching doesn't have to be perfect. Yeah, you're always going to know more than the students coming in. Now, you do have to prepare for it because obviously the students have paid for their education and it's not fair, right? If not, like we're exploiting them, they're anyway. But we have to get into that mindset that it's okay if it's not 100%. It goes back to the same idea about the dissertation, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good. So I completely am in agreement with you. In terms of the job market material, teaching philosophy, for instance, which is like mind-boggling for 5,000 people to understand what that actually means. I would ask, your mentors in your department to provide you with the sample that they've used and to not be mean and not share. And if you need a copy, email me. I would be happy to share. All that material should be shared. We should be helping each other in trying to, make the next phase easier for everybody else. Because just because I had a more difficult time doesn't mean that you have to go through that difficult time. So I think you should always ask, especially with teaching philosophy, because on its own, it's like a whole scholarship of teaching and learning thing on its own, which is completely not something that the departments actually prepare us for within the political science side. So definitely ask for previous material from your mentors.
So I think we're just at time now. I guess one last thing to piggyback off of the final point, it's something that kind of wraps all this together. We haven't explicitly touched on it, but finding community when you're working on your dissertation and transitioning into the academic job market is one of the most beneficial things you could do. It'll help you keep your mental health in check, but it'll also like network you really well in terms of on the professional end, in terms of getting really stellar job market materials ready or teaching materials ready as well. So I think really emphasizing horizontal connections, like making connections with other graduate students, as well as other faculty members who are doing similar research as you, it's probably one of the best things that you could do early on in order to make the dissertation stage and everything that comes after that much more manageable. Andrew, do you have any last words before we sign off?
I'll just say that I think, be sure to forgive yourself and give yourself some leniency as you work on this. To the question on preparing for the job market, last fall semester when I was on the job market, I attempted and failed to do any work on my dissertation. It just did not happen, and I punished myself for that. And in hindsight, obviously I was never going to get any substantial work done in the dissertation while I was also applying for jobs the first time. And I should have, let myself accept that from the very beginning. And it doesn't have to be the job market. It can be your first time teaching a full class. It can be something else happening in your life. But give yourself that ability and ability to walk away and realize that this is actually beneficial in the long term.
So I think with that, we can wrap this up. I want to thank everybody again, especially to our panelists for showing up and discussing this really crucial and interesting question that we have about, graduate school more generally. I hope everybody found this incredibly useful. Tune in again in early May for a workshop that's going to be about fieldwork and navigating fieldwork, and we'll have another one later that May about navigating the job market. So with that being said, we'll see you all then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.